Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and it's so great to be sharing these stories with you again after my break. It's just fabulous being back again, and I hope you're going to enjoy these stories because nothing beats a great story. So before we continue, remember this is part 2 of our story tonight, so if you haven't heard part 1, definitely go back to part 1. And let's continue with part 2 of our story. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with our story. Rodney couldn't believe that Lisa's brash, flirtatious mother was so in your face, as much as the loud house she occupied, as well as her well-endowed statues that you were not allowed to forget, where nothing was left to the imagination. Modesty was clearly not a virtue embraced in the Papadopoulos household. He shouldn't have been surprised by this. Lisa's mother was like mutton dressed up as lamb. Did she not realize how ridiculously silly she looked? A 40-year-old woman, dressing like a teenager going to a disco. She was wearing a tight, very short leopard skin skirt and a black low-cut top, where her very expensive Dolly Parton-sized assets were shown off to their best advantage. There was nothing refined, subtle, or remotely understated by this very abrasive woman, who wanted to stand out like a splash of bright red colour on a David Hockney painting. She had long manicured nails and ash-blonde, very highlighted hair. But it was her crinkled, leathery skin that, from overexposure to the sun, gave her an unfortunate appearance of a wizened tortoise, and the rouge on her cheeks had been so overdone it looked like it had been applied by a child. How could anyone's skin look this leathery? Rodney secretly thought she had probably been sunning herself like a sun-dried tomato at too many luxury resorts on perfectly white sandy beaches all over the world, where she was waited on hand and foot like the Queen of Sheba. He could envisage her bathing in cow's milk like Cleopatra had done, for she would spare herself no extravagance. Quite frankly, she appeared to be as spoilt and self-entitled as Lisa did. It would seem the apple did not fall very far from the tree. "Oh, Rodney, darling, come this way," she said, beckoning for Rodney to follow her with one of her slimy green manicured fingers that looked as treacherously sharp as a cat's claws. "My husband would adore to speak to you now. He's simply dying to meet you. I can't wait to tell him you're here. Lisa has told him all about you, but she never mentioned you looked like the statue of the David. We wouldn't want him to get jealous, would we?" she said, giving Rodney a wink. "Word of warning, my husband is a wee bit intimidating, but he's a teddy bear, really, providing you behave yourself. Then he won't bite," she said, growling again coquettishly. Ah. Rodney found himself being ushered into a palatial office where the gilded leather chairs looked like thrones. The lavish office reeked of wealth and really lousy taste. There was a taxidermist's tiger head on the wall that appeared to be leering at Rodney with its full mouth of sharp canine teeth. It was funny, he thought, how wealthy people loved to have lions or tiger heads on their walls. Was it a symbol of power and prestige, he wondered? Most likely, but Rodney knew he'd far rather see a tiger out in the natural world than trussed up arrogantly and egotistically on someone's wall, like an illustrious hunting trophy. Maybe Mr. Papadopoulos would pretend he'd shot it himself, a tall, fictitious story he'd lightly boast about to his gullible, very impressionable friends, to impress them. People with the glittering collage of new wealth enjoyed to flaunt it. Rodney squirmed with disgust at the very idea. There was nothing impressive about killing the king of the jungle in his book. Rodney glanced around the showy office that was busy with flashy detail and felt incredibly small and inconspicuous. Every part of him wanted to run for the hills as fast as he could, but he tried to remain grounded and tethered to the chair. What did Lisa's father want to talk to him about? Was he going to give him the riot act? Did he know that Rodney had made his daughter pregnant? The very thought made him quiver nervously. while his awkward feet tapped the floor in a self-soothing gesture. Lisa's father, Freddie, entered that office with a huge beam on his face, of perfectly white, expensive teeth that probably cost a fortune at the dentist. Rodney thought that Lisa's father looked like a gangster, with his open white shirt and his large cocky gold chain around his thick neck. He stared at Rodney through his inquisitive dark brown eyes, extending his hand to shake it. His grip was hard, rather fierce and firm. Rodney noticed his very affluent gold rings on his fingers that were studded with what looked like red rubies, although he couldn't be sure. "It's very good to meet you finally, Rodney," he said, in a raspy voice that Rodney suspected meant the man smoked a tad too much. He noticed a box of Cuban cigars on the desk and an ashtray full of used studs. How many cigars did Freddie Papadopoulos smoke a day? The sideboard was cluttered with crystal decanters, filled with every kind of drink. There was an empty tumbler on the desk, and Mr. Papadopoulos smelt of whiskey on his breath, but he wasn't drunk. He was probably one of those men who could handle his booze rather well. Mr. Papadopoulos looked like the kind of man who could handle anything. He had that hard look on his face that gave Rodney the distinct impression that if you rubbed him up the wrong way, it could land you in a whole heap of trouble. "Lisa has told me all about you, Rodney. She can't stop talking about you. She seems quite smitten," he told me. "Now I understand you wish to marry her, and that you and my daughter are expecting your first baby. So congratulations are in order," he said, walking over to Rodney and giving him a hard slap on the back that made Rodney almost jump out of his skin. "I've always wanted a grandchild, Rodney, and he or she, I assure you, will want for nothing. When I learned that you were not of Greek heritage, I was disappointed, I won't deny that. But Lisa assures me you have a great talent with your hands, that you're quite an extraordinary potter and a very skilled artist. Very appreciative I am of people who have gifts like that, and I will spare no expense, Rodney, for you to get the best possible tuition to advance your craft to the highest level." Rodney wanted to tell Lisa's father that he had not planned to marry his daughter, but was willing to do everything he could to be a good father to his child. But he felt tongue-tied, as if he couldn't say a word. All he could say was, "Well, I'm very glad to see you taking responsibility, Rodney. Not many men your age would. And the answer is unequivocally yes. You may indeed have my daughter, my little princess's hand in marriage. I know you're rather bashful to ask me outright, but never you mind, you're still very young. But there is no need to feel so self-conscious. I am delighted to welcome you into the Papadopoulos family with open arms. My little princess tells me she knew you were the one for her the moment she laid her eyes on you. And what my daughter wants, my daughter always gets. I can't help myself as far as my little princess is concerned. She is my entire world. I must give you one word of warning, Rodney. If you hurt my little princess, you will have me to deal with." He lowered his voice to a threatening pitch. "Anyone who hurts my princess is as good as dead, and I mean that literally." He then roared with laughter, "Ha, ha, ha," as if he'd made a huge joke. But Rodney knew that Mr. Papadopoulos was not joking. "Oh, I couldn't help overhearing," said Mrs. Papadopoulos, bursting into the room, holding her daughter's hands. "Did you hear that, Lisa? You're going to get married. Isn't this exciting? Oh, I just can't wait. Oh, and my daughter is marrying such a charming young man. Now the next thing to concern myself with is what I am going to wear for the wedding. I definitely need to stand out so that everybody can admire my outfit. It's very important that I make an impression." Ostensibly, everything had gone like a whirlwind. The power had been removed from Rodney's hands. He'd found himself immersed in the heart of it all, swept away like a helpless dandelion seed on the wind, without being able to navigate himself to a safe mooring place. He couldn't do a damn thing about it. The wedding day had come and gone so quickly, and Mrs. Papadopoulos had headed the whole affair. And Rodney had not been able to get a word in edgeways. So Rodney had reluctantly surrendered to a marriage he had never ever desired, by any manner of means. But with a child now on the way, and with Mr. Papadopoulos breathing down his back, he felt like a caged animal, with nowhere to run. The wedding had been held at a grandiose venue in Charleston, where no expense had been spared for the occasion. If there was any silver lining to this ominously grey cloud, Lisa's parents had generously brought the couple, a gorgeous Georgian farmhouse in the Virginian countryside, to Rodney's taste. Mr. Papadopoulos had got the most perfect pottery studio built for Rodney, whom had spent time as an apprentice under the expert tuition of a great potter, and since then Rodney had been producing masterpieces, which were often on display in some of the finest art galleries in the country, so Rodney had earned a name for himself. Lisa insisted on getting married before she began to show in her wedding dress, as she said she could not abide the prospect of being a fat bride. But 6 months after the wedding, she announced to Rodney that she had miscarried their baby, and the revelation hit Rodney hard. He did wonder if Lisa had been pregnant at all. She did not behave like a young woman who had miscarried. She just smiled and said, "Better luck next time, then." Lisa was used to getting exactly what she wanted. Had their wedding been part of a masterful manipulation, he would never know. One thing he did know was that he loathed his wife. Try as he might to make their relationship work, his spoilt, self-centered wife had few redeeming qualities, and he enjoyed any excuse in the book to be away from her. He encouraged her to go on holidays with her friends, and was always relieved when she was out of the way. In truth, he would have loved nothing better than for his wife to have an affair with another man, so that he could find the quintessential excuse to leave her. But that looked like it was never going to happen, as Lisa, for some incongruous, unexplainable reason, seemed to be head over heels in love with Rodney, which was unfathomable, as the love she had towards him was certainly not reciprocated. "That's no way to live, darling," her mother had told him. "You're very unhappy with Lisa, and I can't blame you, son. She's a frightful young lady. I don't believe I've ever met anyone more spoilt. Do you know, she threw away the Easter eggs I bought the both of you, because she was afraid of getting fat. I was absolutely appalled. At the very least, she could have given them back to me, or let someone less fortunate enjoy them. I remember after Thanksgiving she threw away perfectly good food. The wastage was absolutely insane. So much expensive, perfectly edible food flung into the dustbin. It made me recoil in disgust. I was completely revulsed. Even your dad was grievously upset to see that happen." "That's what she's like, Mum. She's so used to having everything she wants. She's developed this arrogant sense of self-entitlement. I think she sees me as something she owns, like one of her designer shoes or purse. I wish I could like her, but I don't. A marriage is not supposed to be like this, is it, Mum?" "Of course it isn't, son. Oh, I think you should get a divorce. I really do. I mean, you don't have any reason to stay in this relationship, as you don't have a baby to raise. I mean, if you really are so desperately unhappy, there is a way out." "Do you want to know the truth, Mum? Because I don't actually enjoy telling it. But I'm scared to divorce Lisa. If I do anything to hurt Lisa, there is no telling what Mr. Papadopoulos is capable of doing. He is the most threatening, dangerous man that I have ever met. Do you know he was arrested by the police once in a murder investigation, and is linked to a person that went missing?" Mrs. Van Furen let out a gasp. "You're joking, right? Your father mentioned there were rumours of Mr. Papadopoulos being connected to organised crime. But I had no idea about this. Why didn't you tell me? Because I only knew about it a short while ago. I actually told Lisa that her dad looked like he ran a drug cartel. We've been watching a movie together on this thug that was in charge of the Italian mafia, I believe it was. I swear to you, Mum, he looked like Mr. Papadopoulos. Sleek dark hair, devious brown eyes, a thick gold chain around a very sizable neck. When I told Lisa as much, she thought it was hysterically funny. And then she boasted that her dad had been a person of interest in 2 police investigations, would you believe? I actually asked her if she thought he might have committed the crimes. And do you know what she said to me, Mum? Of course, silly, but he's far too clever to get caught. She said that to you, said Mrs. Van Vuren, her eyes widening in horror. She did, Mum. Then she made a rather ominous joke. She poked her finger in my chest and said, "So don't think about divorcing me, Rodney, because you just might go missing as well, and no one would ever know what the hell had happened to you." That sounds like a threat, darling. Do you think she knows you're unhappy in your marriage with her? Of course she knows, Mum. I've even told her as much. But the funny thing is my apathetic indifference towards her makes her want me more. Well, I suppose that might make some kind of sense, said Mrs. Van Vuren. She wants what she can't have, doesn't she? Your being very indifferent towards her is going to make her want you more. You should be playing your cards differently, son. You should act like you're so keen on her that she actually wants to push you away. It's not a bad idea, you know. She'll see right through my act, Mum. I'm not going to be able to pull that kind of stunt off. I can't even bear to touch her. She makes my skin crawl. Look, I could get my solicitor to draw up some divorce papers for you, and when the time is right, you could ask her to sign them. How about that? Do what you want to do, Mum, but I'm not sure I've got the guts to divorce her. If her father wasn't around, it of course would be a different story. I've seen the men who work for him shaking in their boots, and even his own wife is scared of him to a certain extent. And what about Lisa? Has she got any reservations about her father? Oh, no. She's got him wrapped up around her little finger. He will do anything for his little princess. He made that very clear to me from the very beginning. He told me if I so much as hurt a tiny little pinky on her finger, I was a dead man. Well, I must admit, I never warmed to the man at your wedding. Even your father said he was the most frightful person he'd ever had the privilege to meet. Actually, in truth, I think the word he used was thug. Put it this way, Mum. I think it's not just selling bath stuff that has made him into a very wealthy man. I'm sure he has his fingers in some nefarious pies, but the police have never been able to pin a thing on him. As his daughter rightly says, he's too clever for that. Rodney knew his mother was absolutely right, but divorcing Lisa Papadopoulos would certainly mean upsetting her father, and he was absolutely terrified of the man. This insidious man, with his beefcake-like appearance and Rottweiler face, looked like he ran a drug cartel, even though he was actually involved in selling bathroom fixtures and fittings to the rich and famous, would you believe? But certainly if you double-crossed him, there was no telling what he was capable of doing. When Mrs. Van Vuren got some divorce papers drawn up for her beloved son, Rodney looked at them longingly, as if they were dreamy holiday brochures to the Caribbean that he could ill afford. He wondered if he could ever persuade Lisa to sign them. Chance would be a fine thing, he thought, but maybe one day he could tell her that their relationship really was not working, and maybe one day she might just listen and hopefully agree. He hid the papers in a desk in his pottery studio and forgot all about them. 1 year later. It was Tuesday night at the pottery studio, and Rodney was giving a pottery class. People came to him in the evenings and worked until 11 o'clock at night, and then they would go home. Many of his students had jobs during the week and thoroughly enjoyed allowing their creative juices to flow and letting their hair down after a hard day in the office. The Tuesday group were a fun-loving team of students, all eager to become good potters, The banter in the evening class was jovial, humorous, light-hearted, and very relaxed, as indeed it always was. Rodney thoroughly enjoyed his pottery classes. It kept him away from his wife Lisa for a start. Recently she'd become even more belligerent, snapping at him tirelessly like a capricious crocodile. "Why don't you spend more time with me? You spend all your time in that damn studio," she would complain. "You're never there for me." "It's because whenever I'm around you, I find you clingy and very needy. I feel as if I need to escape so that I can breathe." "I'm only clingy because I want to be around you. What's wrong with that, Rodney? Most men appreciate being needed." "Most men appreciate being able to breathe first," Rodney had corrected her. "And most men would like a wife who didn't have a tantrum if everything didn't go their way. You constantly report back to your father about me, and that's not easy to take." "That's because my dad, unlike you, actually has my back." "You can say that again. I mean, we've been married for over 8 years, and you act like an insecure teenager." "That's because I know that you have never loved me, Rodney." "Lisa, I told you that when I married you. I told you I didn't love you. Nothing has changed on that score. But you were the one that insisted we got married. I told you it would be a laborious struggle if there was no spark between us. But you were most insistent that we get married for the sake of our baby. But our baby never came along, did it? So here we are, trapped in a loveless marriage." "What are you saying, Rodney? That I made up my pregnancy to trap you into this marriage?" "I'm saying no such thing. But what I am saying, Lisa, is that you can do so much better than me. You deserve to find a man that will love you back and make you truly happy." "So you want a divorce? Is that what you're saying?" "I'm not saying anything of the kind, Lisa. The ball is entirely in your court. That's what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, should you wish to end our marriage, I will be very agreeable." "Well, that's never going to happen, Rodney. We're together for life, you and me, in sickness and in health. We made that vow together when we got married, and we stood in front of the pastor." "I had no idea you took our marriage vows so seriously, Lisa." "How dare you, Rodney? Of course I did. I did." One of the students at Rodney's pottery studio was a man called Prt2, who had told him that his pottery classes with Rodney had helped him heal from his wife's death, far more efficiently than any of his grief therapy. "It takes my focus off myself," he explained. "I put all my energy into making something beautiful, and then my life feels so much less pitiful. It helps me feel much more optimistic about the world." The other students heartily agreed that a creative outlet had made them discover more colour in their lives. "My husband does woodwork," said a woman called Selina, "and I do pottery. We both need time away from our cell phones, the offices, and our children. The pottery studio for me is my place for rejuvenation, and when I make a pot, I feel a great sense of accomplishment. I never feel that same level of achievement when I'm at work, when I calculate the monthly takings, or when I've cleaned up the house, only for it to get messy all over again. But when I make a pot, I've got something to show for my work, and that is a very satisfactory feeling indeed." It was after tea break at about 10 o'clock that they heard the ominous sound of heavy boots thundering towards the studio door, moving at an efficiently fast pace. Then there was an unpleasant, loud rapping sound at the studio door. But before Rodney could answer the door, it was swung open. Everyone looked up, somewhat startled from their clay pots, to observe who could be intruding on them so rudely at this late time of the night. It had been such a pleasant evening up till now, but being interrupted so impertinently like this was not a good feeling. Rodney's knees almost crumbled beneath him when he saw Mr. Papadopoulos standing there in the pottery studio, leering at him with a murderous expression on his face, which not only served to intimidate Rodney, but his entire pottery class. For the insolent man glared fiercely at everyone through fiery brown eyes, and his powerful biceps bulged from beneath his white shirt, as he punched the air in indignation, pointing his thick finger at Rodney accusingly. "How dare you, Rodney?" said Mr. Papadopoulos, not caring about the interested audience of pupils now watching him. "I've just been speaking on the phone to my daughter. She's in a terrible state, crying like a baby she is. You've broken my little princess's heart, and you better bloody fix up this mess. She tells me you've been hinting about a divorce." All the pupils in the pottery studio glanced at each other. So this must be Rodney's father-in-law, they mused to themselves. Not a very likeable man. "You know what I said to you, Rodney, when you married my daughter? Or have you conveniently got a shorter memory than I suspected you'd have? I told you that if you ever so much as hurt her little Pinky, I would—" He growled venomously at Rodney, his legs thumping the ground like a trumpeting elephant. "Look, Mr. Papadopoulos, I don't mean to be rude, but can we please take this outside? Not in front of my pupils, please," he said, removing a torch from the shelf. "Fair enough," said Mr. Papadopoulos, nodding at the pupils. "I apologise for the intrusion," he said. "Let's go outside, then. A walk in the woodgrove might be nice." Selina's account. I have been one of Rodney's pottery pupils for over 6 years now, so I've known him for a long time. I hasten to say he is one of the nicest people I've ever had the privilege to meet, who is a master at his craft. One day I decided my life was far too pedestrian. I was reading a book on how I could step out of my comfort zone, to do something different to change my life. And that was when I decided to take up pottery classes, which became a huge passion for me, under Rodney's masterful tuition. I was producing some quality work. I never saw Rodney's wife much, but when Lisa did come into the pottery studio, I did find myself wondering how someone like Rodney could have married someone so obnoxious. She'd come into the studio and wasn't afraid to have a good old gripe at Rodney in front of the whole class. I could see she was a self-entitled brat, used to getting her own way. Her conversation with Rodney would go something like this. "But I want to go on that cruise with you. Daddy is going to pay. It'll be a month away for us. It'll be amazing." To which Rodney would reply, "I'm sorry, Lisa, but I can't go. I've already taken too much leave off this year." "But why don't you go without me?" The woman would become belligerent. "You're such a spoil-sport, Rodney. I can't believe how utterly selfish you're being." "Look, Lisa, I'm not trying to be difficult, but I'm very busy. I have clients waiting for my pots on order. I've scheduled pottery classes to teach. I can't just abandon everything at will. I have responsibilities." "Who cares about them? Dad'll give you the money you need to cover any shortfalls." "That's not the problem, Lisa." "What about your responsibility to me? I am your wife, in case you've forgotten," she would say, straddling her hands on her hips and rolling her eyes indignantly at the back of her head. "Lisa, this is not about money. It's about integrity. I don't want to let my customers down, do I? Besides, I do have some dignity. I don't want to go through life living on your father's handouts. I'm happy to support the both of us without his interference. I'm quite capable of managing our financial affairs without him." "What on earth is wrong with you, Rodney? Most normal people wouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth like you do. But oh, I forgot, Rodney. You're so not normal," she would say, scrunching up her face disapprovingly. "I guess I'll have to go on the cruise on my own then. It's typical of you to let me down. What am I going to say to people? My husband's got too many responsibilities with his clay pots. How pathetic is that going to sound?" she said, hitting a chair so hard that it somersaulted across the floor, landing on its side. "You're pathetic, Rodney," she'd say, storming out of the studio. I felt very sorry for Rodney. He would apologise for the fortuitous outburst, and we would continue to work, as if nothing had happened. But we could all sense the tension between the couple. It didn't take a rocket scientist to feel that Rodney and his wife had a tumultuous relationship, and although he never discussed his personal life, I guessed he was exceedingly unhappy in his marriage. By all accounts, it would take a saint to be married to such a difficult, tempestuous, overbearing woman, and all the men at the studio certainly said as much. When Rodney was not around to hear our discussions, of course. We all did wonder why Rodney did not divorce the woman, and soon learnt why he'd refrained from getting a divorce. Rodney was clearly terribly afraid of his father-in-law, Mr. Papadopoulos, and who could blame him? When Rodney's capriciously belligerent father-in-law thundered into the studio late on Tuesday night, shouting the odds at Rodney in front of the entire class, let's just say he was without doubt one of the scariest, most cantankerous men I have ever seen. He reminded me of those thuggish gangsters you see on crime movies, who don't hesitate to execute anyone who betrays them. The kind of man who would have a decapitated head on his desk to put the fear of God in anyone daring to think of not serving his every demand faithfully. Rodney did not want his father-in-law to discuss the personal issues he was having with his wife in front of the entire pottery studio, and who could blame him for that? But certainly in hindsight, I wish he had aired all his dirty linen in front of us, because there's safety in numbers. I didn't have a good feeling when Rodney left the studio with this odorous man to have a discussion out of doors. I hoped he wouldn't say anything to this volatile man, who had the potential to explode like a landmine. He appeared to me in every way to be exceedingly dangerous. Let's just say, when Mr. Papadopoulos and Rodney left the studio, me and the other pottery students stared at each other in abject horror. The first thing I said to the pupils is, "That man is dangerous. Did you see he was carrying a revolver in his holty? I don't like his dark energy. He's extremely sinister." "Aren't you being a little dramatic, Selina?" Peter said gingerly. "I mean, granted, his father-in-law looks malicious, but he's hardly going to hurt Rodney. Rodney is his son-in-law, for goodness sake." I wasn't sure that Peter was right. One always learnt that murders in people's lives were usually rather close to home. I pretended I needed to leave the pottery studio to get a tool of mine for the pot I was making, which I claimed to have left in the car. To my horror, I could see Mr. Papadopoulos leading Rodney into the woodgrove. I heard him say, "If you don't want your students to hear what I have to say to you, let's go for a walk in the woodgrove." "I'm not sure that's a good idea," Rodney had said. "It's quite dark in there." "Well, we've got your torch, have we not?" Mr. Papadopoulos said. I didn't like the sound of any of this, so I trotted over to my car and grabbed a torch, along with a baseball bat that I kept in my truck at all times. I clandestinely followed the two men through the trees. It was a dark, inauspicious night. I say that because there was a cool breeze blowing, but it was making a slight wailing sound, and then there were these strange howling sounds coming from within the woodgrove that were hauntingly airy and made me quiver uneasily. The night hung around me like a thick black blanket. The light of the moon had been rudely expunged. Even the stars could not be seen scribbling their twinkling lights over the sky. It was as if the thick cover of dark mist had concealed all their light, which made venturing into the woods all the more daunting for me. I'd never been keen on the dark. I'd always been terribly nervous driving home at night after a pottery class, but Rodney's lessons made the trips worth my while and helped me conquer my reservations. I could hear the loud, angry voices of the two men talking, and I chose to discreetly follow behind them, despite my obvious reluctance. I was concerned about Rodney's welfare. I didn't trust this man a single inch. Why did he need to talk to Rodney in the woods? Was it so he could be far away from the prying eyes of the pottery students? The man gave off such a bodeful, uncouth energy. "Look, Mr. Papadopoulos," I heard Rodney saying, "I don't know what Lisa has told you, but please don't overreact about this. Yes, I am sorry she's upset. I didn't intentionally mean to hurt her." "Upset? My daughter is devastated. Not only does she say you have never loved her, but that you are actually asking her for a divorce indirectly. My daughter does not want a divorce with you, Rodney. Do you understand what I'm saying? God only knows what she sees in you. Personally, I would have been so much happier if she'd married a high-profile Greek man, but she chose you. And under no circumstances are you going to leave my daughter. Do you understand me? Because if you do, I will make your life a living hell. And believe me, you Rodney, you haven't got the faintest clue what I am capable of. If you remember, Mr. Papadopoulos, there was no choice in our marriage, Rodney boldly interceded. We married because Lisa was pregnant. We were not in love, and there's never been any connection between us. Correction! You might not have been in love with my daughter, Rodney, but Lisa was very much in love with you from the very beginning, and you knew that. Of course I know that, Mr. Papadopoulos, but it wasn't reciprocated. My daughter married you, Rodney. She is your wife. You are responsible for her, and you are going to treat her like a queen, or I will bloody kill you. Do you understand that? I will kill you without any hesitation. No one treats my little Lisa with disrespect, and if they do, I will make them regret it. Please don't threaten me, Mr. Papadopoulos. The two men continued to argue together. I noticed Mr. Papadopoulos was getting more and more unhinged, and I suspect it was because Rodney was standing up for himself for the first time in his entire life, and was saying to him a few home truths that he didn't want to hear. It alarmed me. I don't know why Rodney was being so assertive in the woods. It made him exceedingly vulnerable. Now was not the time to stand up for himself in the presence of such a big, intimidating bully. When I saw Mr. Papadopoulos's fingers fiddling with his revolver on his holty, I wondered if he was planning to suddenly shoot Rodney. He certainly was getting hot under the collar. I reasoned with myself that this man would not dare to harm Rodney. There were several witnesses back at the pottery studio who would know that if anything untoward had happened to Rodney, Mr. Papadopoulos would be likely to blame. Slippery men like him weren't stupid. As I was following the two men into the woods, I sensed someone else was tagging behind me. I thought maybe it was one of the pottery students. I felt a wee bit annoyed. I'm not sure why I felt annoyed. You'd think I'd appreciate the company. I gleaned the only reason they were following me was because they were incredibly snoopy, very curious about what the men were talking about. And I knew who it was. I was certain it was Angelica Button. That was the one pupil in our class that was an unquenchable gossip. She was not being very discreet, but I absolutely knew she was there. I wasn't stupid. I could hear a twig breaking and feet tagging behind me very clandestinely. I chose to willfully ignore her, even though I wanted to hiss at her and tell her to leave me the hell alone. But such foolish actions might have made both men aware of my presence, and I was here to watch over Rodney, to make absolutely certain he wasn't in danger. Mr. Papadopoulos and Rodney had stopped for a moment. They were talking in an open clearing in the woods. Their words were not discernible to me, but I knew by Mr. Papadopoulos's inflammatory gestures that he was not impressed by any manner of means. While I was discreetly hiding behind a tree, peering curiously at the two men, who had become less ambiguous and obscure, as suddenly the woods had become a whole lot lighter, I realized it was because the moon had come out like the sun after the rain. It audaciously trespassed through the open branches of the trees. Its silvery ethereal light lit up the whole area, and with Rodney's high-powered torchlight, the intimidating darkness had greatly receded. I will admit I felt the tight tension in my chest ebbing away, like the smoke from a chimney. I was still very much on edge. I was afraid that Mr. Papadopoulos was about to beat up his son-in-law, and I couldn't allow that to happen. If needs must, I would whack him hard at the back of his head with a baseball bat to render him unconscious for a while, in order to rescue my pottery teacher from his wrath. Had he cunningly lured his son-in-law into the woodgrove to beat him up within an inch of his life, to teach him a lesson? Maybe he didn't want to kill his son-in-law, but he had in mind to hurt him badly. I suspected as much. My hands trembled as I contemplated what I must do. The energy between the two men was getting heated. As Mr. Papadopoulos was pointing an accusing finger at Rodney, I could see his face jiggling with indignation, and the muscle on his jaw clenched tightly. In that precise moment, I could feel Angelica's body brushing against mine, as she too was impertinently peering through the trees with me. The nerve of the woman, I thought. Bloody cheek! Did that woman have absolutely no boundaries? Did she know nothing about giving people their personal space? I gave her a slight angry push to express my level of annoyance, and she pushed me back. Now I could feel the anger coursing through me like a steam train. I turned around to give her a glare, but it wasn't Angelica standing next to me. It was a young, curious male Bigfoot. I am not sure how I actually knew that this Bigfoot was young, as it certainly looked like an adult, standing up on 2 legs at easily over 7 foot tall and possibly 600 pounds. But I knew it was a youngling that hadn't fully grown into his body yet. The Bigfoot's expressive face was startlingly human. He possessed an excitable, callow, juvenile energy, as if he naively, whimsically thought we were playing a wonderful, exciting game of hide and seek. I would normally have been terrified of such an imposing creature, but I could see by the expression in his animated treacle-coloured eyes that he thought we were embroiled in an exciting game together, of which he wanted to play an intrinsic part, so I knew he was totally harmless. I was completely bemused to be standing next to such an outlandish creature, but I couldn't allow his presence to steal my focus. At that precise moment, I noticed that Mr. Papadopoulos had grabbed Rodney by the collar of his shirt, and that was when I sprang into action, rushing through the trees towards Mr. Papadopoulos with a baseball bat in my hand, and the Bigfoot running behind me. Of course, I didn't know he was doing that at this stage. I began to swing the bat precariously in my hands, trying to aim at Mr. Papadopoulos's head, with very little success. The swings of my bat were most ungainly. Mr. Papadopoulos seemed to be staring past me, not at me, his face growing a funny shade of green, his eyes growing wide with terror. Mr. Papadopoulos was frightened of my baseball bat. I could hardly believe it. I've never seen a grown man trembling so much before. I mean, at 145 pounds, I was hardly that intimidating, was I? Mr. Papadopoulos tried to say something. His mouth opened and closed like a startled goldfish. He clutched his chest tightly and went falling backwards onto the ground. It was then that I realized it was not me that had caused Mr. Papadopoulos to shudder in terror, but the male Bigfoot behind me, who was waving his arms around like I had been doing with the baseball bat, to mimic me, and his movements looked very threatening. I suppose, in the circumstances, it wasn't surprising that Mr. Papadopoulos was so alarmed. The Bigfoot looked disappointed to see that Mr. Papadopoulos was now lying on the ground, motionless, as if he really thought the fun game had finally come to a disappointing end. We heard a strange, unusual call from the woods. It sounded like a voice calling the name, "Hasta! Hasta!" The Bigfoot looked down at Mr. Papadopoulos, and then up at me, and he looked at Rodney, his face registering bitter disappointment. I guessed his mum was calling him from the trees. Then I heard the words in my head. "My mum's calling me. I can't play any more. I'm sorry, I have to go." He patted me on the back like a good old friend. "Great game," he said to me telepathically. Then he was gone like greased lightning, swinging his arms backwards and forwards, as on nimble athletic feet he charged through the trees like a bullet. "What the hell?" said Rodney. "A Bigfoot? I never expected to see one of those things. I didn't even know they were real. Did you see how human his face was?" Rodney got onto his knees, was leaning over his father-in-law, slapping his face. "Mr. Papadopoulos! Mr. Papadopoulos, can you hear me? Mr. Papadopoulos, are you all right? Please say something." But Mr. Papadopoulos did not move. His face was as white as a piece of paper. Rodney looked at me through bewildered eyes. "I think he's had a heart attack," he said. He was terrified of the Bigfoot. His heart just stopped in panic. "But the Bigfoot was only a youngling. He was harmless," I insisted. "You didn't see how he was throwing his arms around. A strong creature like that. Very intimidating, I assure you." "He was just mimicking me," I insisted. "People can die of shock, you know," said Rodney, as he tried to attempt CPR in vain on Mr. Papadopoulos. But his attempts were fruitless, and when the emergency services arrived, they announced him dead. But I could have told Rodney that, from the moment that Mr. Papadopoulos fell over, because his eyes were glazed over like a dead fish. I was to learn later that Mr. Papadopoulos had great issues with his heart. He was taking warfarin, a blood thinner, and suffered from ventricle fibrillation, an irregular heartbeat. I genuinely think he died of shock because he saw the Bigfoot. But if the truth be told, I felt relief that such an obnoxious character was finally gone. There was no telling what he was capable of. I considered him a volatile and dangerous man. Rodney's final comments. When Lisa found out what had happened, she was devastated, blaming me for everything that had happened. She hurled herself at me and began slapping me. "You upset my dad so much. He had a massive heart attack because of you. You knew he had issues with his heart. He's had issues for a long time," she said, spitting venom at me. "I don't know why the hell I ever married you. I want a divorce," she demanded. Little did she realize that her own father had died from a cardiac arrest brought on by the stress of seeing a juvenile Bigfoot throwing his arms around in a threatening manner, and the sheer terror of encountering such an outlandish creature he thought was about to kill him had brought on the heart attack. But I had no intention of telling Lisa that. These days, I swear, if it wasn't for that male Bigfoot, I would be stuck in my miserable marriage with Lisa. So perhaps every single cloud does indeed have a silver lining. Let's just say there were not many people desperately sad to see the last of Mr. Papadopoulos, and Mrs. Papadopoulos wasn't even very aggrieved herself. And on learning her daughter was getting a divorce from me, she began to flirt outrageously. "Oh, Rodney, I did hear about your divorce, that you're getting divorced with my daughter. Well, in the circumstances, I was thinking the two of us might get together at some point. I do assure you, you won't be disappointed. Older women can be so exciting," she said. Let's just say that was enough to make me move away as fast as I could to escape the licentious woman. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.